All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back. Harmless Dave here, the real music observer, observing real music in real time for real people just like you right there and just like me right here. Continuing to unpack this big interview, Steve Perry, Dan Rather. When they were talking about music, it's like, you're rubbing your hands together thinking this is going to be some good stuff, and it was. I really liked when they dug into the whole Sam Cooke thing because for years, everybody has just assumed that Steve Perry was influenced by Sam Cooke, and I'm sure he said it in other places. But in this particular video, we hear Steve Perry's heart on what Sam Cooke was and how he influenced Steve. I love the part where they're talking about how Sam Cooke would sing a line and basically sing it back to himself almost in the same phrase, talking about the phrasing, which Steve Perry obviously took a little bit of that Sam Cooke. And it's funny because people will then hear another song by a different artist, and they've got that vocal tendency or quality that Steve Perry has, and they'll be like, "Oh, that's a little Steve Perry in that particular song," and I'm more to say, well, that's actually a little bit of Sam Cooke in that song. Grayson Hugh has this song called "Talk It Over" from the '80s, and he does the Steve Perry thing, which is actually the Sam Cooke thing. It's a great song, by the way, and it's one of those tunes that if Steve wanted to cover it, Steve, hint, hint, little maybe bonus track on your next album would be really cool. But Steve, I think, is really into recording his own material and writing new stuff. So I won't hold it against him if he decides to not record Talk It Over. But the interview itself, to me, other than all the personal stuff, which, again, yesterday I talked about the blockbuster nature of some of that. Some of it was kind of assumed or known by his hardcore fans. But the music stuff, to me, is always the most interesting because you can see the collision here, especially when he was joining Journey. You had this jam band who, I don't want to say they weren't going places. They could have kept it together, but the record label was threatening to boot them. Maybe they got picked up by another label. Maybe they didn't. They didn't want to risk it. And Herbie Herbert wanted this to be a successful venture. He didn't want to just have these guys merged together and then, sort of fade into the sunset, into oblivion and not return. Perry was their ticket to fame, definitely. There's no question about it. I think they would have continued on maybe without him, and maybe they could have evolved into this perennial jam band thing. A jam band industry right now is still a very lucrative business, and people go for the musical experience, which I think really appeals to Neil Sean's sensibility. But as far as making chart history, Perry was the reason, and it was this collision of a guy who loved Motown, R&B, and whose main mentor, I think, here is Sam Cooke, fusing with this hard rock, jazz-infused, or, jazz fusion. A lot of people think, it's not a jazz band. Journey wasn't a jazz band. They had some jazz tendencies, and mainly because Neil Sean's guitar was really, influenced by a lot of those types of artists, and they were really trying to make a clean break from Santana. They weren't into the congas or any of those types of Latin instruments. I think they wanted to go in a different direction. But that merger created a lot of creativity, and then eventually Perry would take the thing over, like on Raised on Radio, where if you listen back to that album, the rhythm section has kind of got that funky Motown thing going, and it's mixed in with that 80s sound at the time and a little bit of the leftover mojo from Frontiers, but really still, this was a big departure. And all of that really is Perry. Perry brought the band to that place. And even on Trial by Fire, which again reflected some of the production values of the 1990s, was still more of a sentimental, more of a West Coast meets, I don't know, it had a different flavor than obviously the previous album, Raised on Radio. It was a bit more just plain adult contemporary, whereas I think Raised on Radio really tapped into every influence that Steve Perry had growing up listening to the radio. So, very interesting musical stuff that you got out of this interview. If you're a fan of just how things kind of evolve and eventually become part of someone's own style, the Sam Cooke, Steve Perry connection, and just hearing Steve talk about what these types of artists meant to him and how music saved him, because he was in a lot of despair as a kid, and I think the music really got him out of it. And I think at 70 years old, he's got that spark again, which is fantastic. I mean, to have that kind of passion for music, it's like a natural cure for what ails you. So kudos to Steve. Kudos again to Dan Rather for a decent interview. I know I make fun of Dan, but this was actually a really good interview, and certainly sheds a lot of new light, or at least it illuminates the stuff we thought might be true about Steve Perry. So, done with this one. Be back soon. Stay tuned for that. Have a great day.